Okay, we are recording this meeting now. This is a training session of Traffic Engineering 101. And today we have DKS Associates who is going to present, and they are our new traffic engineer as of May 1st. And so Ria, go for it.
All right, thank you, Josh. Yeah, so today I'll be presenting a planning commission work session. We wanted to introduce traffic engineering and community planning for your city. Oh, sorry, it's not going. So just a brief overview of our agenda. I'm going to introduce our team that will be supporting you, as Josh said, in our new contract and providing development review services. And then I also want to do kind of a high level look at long-term transportation planning and provide some background on that. And then we'll get into more detailed near-term transportation planning. So quickly, some introductions for our team. My name is Ria Flizikowski. I'm a senior transportation engineer. I have my degree in civil engineering, and I've been at DKS Associates for 23 years. And my expertise is providing development review services for multiple agencies here in the Portland metro area and in Southwest Washington. And then I also do quite a bit of long-range community planning as well for communities all over the Pacific Northwest. I can't do this without help from other people on my team as well. So I'll also have help from Kevin Chewick. He's a senior transportation planner at DKS. He's been there for 14 years. And his background is in transportation planning and urban and regional planning. Kevin also specializes in on-call development review services for several cities in Oregon. And he also has some local expertise in Oregon City. He worked on your current transportation system plan. He worked on the system development charges update. And he's also worked on several sub-area plans that have been implemented in Oregon City. And then lastly, I'll also have some support from Amanda Daring. She's also a transportation engineer. She's been at DKS for 6 years, and she works for several cities as well, supporting me and Kevin, providing on-call development review services. She also worked locally on the Thimble Creek concept plan, and she's just going to start working on some I-5 tolling support as well for the city. So let's dig into some long-term planning. I wanted to provide a little bit of background. There are a lot of transportation plans that inform what we do in Oregon City, providing both policies and projects. So starting at a high level, there's the Oregon Highway Plan that's adopted by the Oregon Transportation Commission. We use that a lot to provide directions on policies and standards for the state system. And as you know, there's several state roadways that go through the city. You know, there's Oregon 212, Highway 99. So we would be looking at the Oregon Highway Plan for direction for those. And then there's also the Oregon Transportation Planning Rule, which is a subset of the Oregon Administrative Rules. And it really lets us or guides us with all things transportation from a state level. What types of analysis are required, how decisions are made. And then Metro also has their own regional transportation plan. And that applies to Oregon City because you are in the urban growth boundary in the metro area of Portland. And that really provides some guidance on some land use categories that we apply, like town centers or regional centers. And there's some land use and transportation guidelines and policies that we follow from that as well. And then Clackamas County has a transportation system plan, which really only influences Oregon City, I think, kind of on the edge of the city. And when it starts to transition to a rural area, that's really where you'll see a lot of the county's facilities. And then, of course, the Oregon City Transportation System Plan is your local plan that helps guide long-range decisions for transportation. And I'm going to go through the TSP just a little bit. So the city has a comprehensive plan that provides a vision for 2040, and that's there on the right. Very high level goals and visions, looking at healthy and welcoming communities, providing a diverse economy, having a connected infrastructure and a protected environment. And then from those, the transportation system plan drills down to more specific goals just for transportation. And those are those 8 goals that are here on the left. And just really high level, the objectives are looking at, healthy and safety for residences, providing effective and efficient managements through the transportation system, making sure the system's sustainable, making sure the system is equitable, balanced, and connected for all users, making sure solutions and funding are set to meet the needs in the future, increasing the convenience and availability for walking, biking, and riding transit in the city, ensuring the system supports a prosperous and competitive economy, and also making sure that we're complying with state and regional plans. So those are just really high level goals that the transportation system is trying to fulfill with the decisions that we make. And this is just a little snapshot from your current TSP showing where the projected growth is across the city. I thought this might be helpful when we're going to start talking about development review. So looking at the year 2010 up to the year 2035, it was estimated that there would be 21,000 households and 23,000 jobs within the city of Oregon City. And over that 25-year period, that equals a 58% growth in households and a 61% growth in jobs. So some fairly significant growth is expected. And again, this goes all the way back to 2010. I'm sure you guys have been seeing it because now it's 2022, and quite a bit of this growth has been realized over time. And then just high level, some of the outcomes that have come out of the transportation system plan. It gives us some regulatory framework, which is those goals that I just presented to you a couple slides back, and some policies. There's also design standards, like what roadways need to look like, what are the spacing standards for various types of roads, and then also the development code that comes and helps us reach those objectives that come out of the framework. There's also recommended projects. Your current TSP has over $200 million of identified transportation needs. And then each of those are separated into master plans for walking, biking, and transit and driving. And then each of those have priorities. And that little pie chart on the bottom left is just a snapshot from the TSP showing how those over $20 million of projects are split between the various modes. You can see driving is the highest, but walking and biking and paths are right behind it. There's also some family-friendly facilities and then some crossings. And then funding, the TSP had forecasted that there will be just under $40 million available to build the projects that are needed over the next 20 years. And funding comes from gas tax revenue. That's a big one. The city does collect system development charges, which is a cost per new trip from development. And then the city also takes contributions through each development application towards fronting improvements or any other offsite impacts that they have. And we'll talk about that more in detail later in the presentation. Thanks, that was just an overview of long-range planning. So now I want to get into more of the transportation analysis that we do in the short term whenever there's a development application and the traffic engineering principles that we apply. So the city typically requires a transportation impact study or a TIS. And the objective here is really to make sure that we can provide an objective assessment of potential impacts from a specific land use action. And that could be a development application. Sometimes it's a request for a zone change on a parcel, or sometimes it's a more high-level comprehensive plan amendment. So those are the things that would trigger the need to do a transportation impact study. And I wanted to make sure we were really clear on the types of questions that we're trying to answer when we get a traffic impact study from a development. So we're really focused on will the existing system accommodate the proposed development from a capacity and a safety standpoint? And I think that's important. It's the capacity and safety standpoint that we're really focused on. How will the study intersections operate relative to the city's mobility standards? What on-site or off-site improvements will be necessary to support the development? And are they projects that have already been identified in the transportation system plan? And then how will access to the development affect traffic operations nearby? And how will the development ensure a safe and efficient circulation both on and adjacent to the site? And how will the development provide needed multimodal connections to adjacent parcels? So while I'm going to go through the next few slides and talk, it's going to get a little technical, about transportation engineering. They're really focused on answering these questions so we can make that objective assessment if there are any impacts from the development. So the city has transportation impact study guidelines and procedures that need to be followed. So first, we determine what is in the scope of the TIS. What do they really need to focus on to make sure that we're answering those questions? So we will work with the developer's contracted traffic engineer to determine what study intersections do we need to look at. What are the most important locations that are nearby or intersections that we know have a known issue that we want to keep track of. We also work with them to determine what the analysis years should be. If they're not opening for a couple years, or if it's a large development and they're phased over time, we want to make sure that we're looking at the right years. And then also the time period is really important. We typically do look at the evening weekday peak hour, but depending on the land use, that could change. If it's a school, we want to look at the morning and then the afternoon peak when school starts and when it stops. It could be a church and we want to look at Sundays. If it's a coffee shop, we want to make sure that we're capturing the morning so we can see the full impact of the development. And then the objective is really to assess any sort of development impact against known standards. And I'll talk about standards a little bit more too, but I think it's really important to note that if there isn't a standard for something, we can't measure against it and we can't show that there's an impact. And then they do a detailed system performance. They need to estimate how many new trips will be coming from the new development. What are the intersection operations before and after the development opens, so we can compare that. Looking if there's any need for multimodal connections so that the development isn't isolated and that they're connecting appropriately to the surrounding area. If there are any safety needs that come with the development, and then making sure that their site access is located appropriately. And then once their evaluation is done, they recommend some mitigations to help address those impacts. And those could be construction of any off-site improvements that are needed to meet standards, constructing frontage improvements, if those aren't already done, that would meet the city's roadway cross-section standards. And then also paying any fees towards planned improvements. And those could be the city's set system development charges, or it could be a proportionate share if they are adding trips to an intersection that's where the city has set up the methodology for that and they're collecting a fee. So let's get a little bit more into the details just so you guys know what I'm talking about. So trip generation is a really important part of development review. And then this is where we are estimating the new trips that would come from the development. And this is based on ITE, or the Institute of Transportation Engineers, trip rates. They are a nationally known organization that actually collect trip information from surveys at comparable land uses. And this is something that we use often. All of the surveys and the data are by land use categories. So there's very detailed ones about different types of residential types or office types, or different types of retail, also industrial uses. Those are all in there and described in detail. So when a development comes in, they need to find the land use category that is most comparable to what they are proposing. And then they can use those ITE rates, which is the number of trips per a certain unit of their size. It could be like the number of households that you're proposing, or the square footage, the square feet of a shopping center that you're proposing. That's most of them. A gas station is by gas pump. So it's really tailored so it appropriately fits the proposed development. And I have a little example here on the side just from a study that I grabbed that you can see how they're doing it. There's also some trip reductions that are allowed for some uses. A pass-by trip is when a trip is already on the network and they would already be driving by a development site, and they wouldn't necessarily be a new trip. And that's for retail. Say you're already driving by McDonald's and you decided to stop and grab lunch and then go right back onto the street. It wasn't a new trip just to McDonald's. You were already going somewhere else. So we do allow some discounting for that to make sure that we're not overestimating the number of trips. And then we also have a type of trip reduction that we allow for diverted trips, which are similar to pass-by trips, but instead of a driver driving by the driveway, say they might reroute or divert a little bit a couple of blocks over to get somewhere. That's a little more complicated because they still need to track the trip if it changes its path where it goes, but it's still a reduction that we allow, and the traffic study would have to document it clearly what those trip reductions look like. And then there's also a reduction for internal trips. If it's a larger development that has several mixed uses, say there's some apartments, and then there's also like a grocery store, and then maybe an office building. There are people within that development that are making trips between each of those, either walking, biking, or driving, but they are not adding new trips to the actual public roadway system. So we do allow some accountability for that too. And ITE has a really detailed process that you go through that helps us determine, say 15% of the total trips would be internal to each other, and we wouldn't want to look at those as new trips on the system. And then you can see, just to the right, I gave a little bit of an example of, you can see there's a land use category, or the land use column, and then they found the ITE code that goes with that, and then they plugged in the side of their development. And then the columns to the right, that's them estimating daily trips, and then you can see the peak hours that they looked at, and this one has a Saturday as well. And then these are the new trips, like the bottom row, that get applied to the traffic study at the intersections. And that's this. So once we know how many new trips are going to be generated, we need to assign them to the system. So there is an estimation of, so we know where the trips start and stop, but how are they going to get to other locations through the city? And you can see there's an approximation here on this figure to the right. We make some estimates. 20% go up this arterial, or 15% go to and from the east on this arterial. And then those new trips are assigned to the study intersections based on those percentages of the distribution that we estimate. Sometimes we will use the travel forecast model that's available. That's a good way for us to determine what the travel patterns could be. But also there is just a bit of engineering judgment. Once you get to know a city and what the travel patterns are, it's usually pretty easy to know. You kind of help estimate, well, this many want to go to 205. This many wants to go, up Oregon 213. And it becomes fairly consistent over time. You can start to get a good idea. And then the trips are added to the study intersections based on that routing. And then that's what they use to run their operations to determine if there's any impacts at those intersections. We do also apply background growth, and that comes from if there are any nearby developments that have been approved by the city but have not been constructed. They will take the trips generated in that development's traffic impact study and layer them on top of their analysis to make sure that they're accounted for. And then that's an important piece. You could have one neighborhood next to the other, and you want to make sure that you're always cumulatively adding the trips to make sure that you're looking at the full impact of both what's been approved and the development that you're currently looking at. And then there's also growth outside the city. I mean, I know you guys probably feel like you get quite a bit of cut through on some of your major arterials, but we also have some estimates to make sure if there's growth in the county or in other adjacent cities that we're accounting for that as well on some of the regional facilities. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the mobility standards that we use to determine if there is an impact. So when you're evaluating the operations at the study intersections in a traffic impact study, we look at level of service, which is a measurement of how much vehicle delay is at that intersection. And it's the entire intersection on average. So one approach may be much higher than the other, but it takes all of the vehicle delay and it's an average for the intersection. And then we also look at something called the volume to capacity ratio, and that measures how much capacity is used up at that location. For an example, say an intersection can adequately serve 2,000 vehicles and the current volume going through that intersection is 1,000. Then we would say it has a VC ratio of 0.5, half or 50% of the capacity is used up there. And then both of these kind of vary by the different control types at intersections. Signalized or signals are looked at differently than unsignalized intersections. And then the city also has some different standards depending on the location as well. The Metro Regional Transportation Plan has arterials that are a little bit different. They have a higher threshold of the operating standard. And then there's also the Oregon City Regional Center. And it also has a different standard that we apply. And I added this little graphic at the bottom. I think this is a good way to kind of see how congestion can progress. So starting on the left, that's a level of service A, that's the best. And you can see at the top, it shows the volume capacity ratio from 0 to 0.2. So that would be up to 20% of the capacity is taken by the volume. And then as you move to the right, conditions become more congested. Level service B, you can see the VC rises a bit, and then C even more. And then when you get to D, which is your standard for some roadways, you can see that you're getting to 70 or 80% of the capacity is filled. That's when you start to see longer delays. The queuing at traffic signals will start to be longer, like not every car is making each cycle at the traffic signal. And then when you get to level service E, it becomes more pronounced. The delays get longer. The queuing at signals and stop signs at unsignalized intersections can get longer. And then level of service F is really when there is more volume or demand at an intersection than capacity is available. And that's when you start getting very long delays and really long queue lengths. So a traffic impact study also includes a safety assessment. The developer study is required to look at historical collision data, typically over the last 4 years for all of the study intersections. And then from that, they need to identify if there's any trends from collisions that have occurred, or if there are any potential safety issues that they want to reveal. And then we can determine if there are, would there be any additional issues if they added vehicle trips to those intersections. And below I clipped a table out of a traffic study just to show it's by intersection, and then you can see the type of data we usually look at, the types of collisions, whether they're rear ends or if they've maybe hit a fixed object, if a pedestrian's involved. And then we also look at severity to see if it was just a minor crash or an injury, and then the total crashes. So the traffic impact study also looks at access for the site and compares those to the spacing standards of the city. And these are based on the functional classification of the facility, whether it's an arterial, a collector, local street, and they're also based on the fronting land uses, depending on if it's residential, industrial, commercial, and then they kind of vary by size. And there is a table in the transportation system plan that dictates these. There are both maximum and minimum block lengths that need to be met. And then there's also an intersection spacing standard that needs to be met. There's also a minimum driveway spacing as well, and a traffic signal spacing. So with all of those standards, we're trying to make sure if the proposed site access is at the best location for that site. and also that they're meeting the spacing standards from all the other adjacent either intersections or driveways. And then another thing that the city allows is called a transportation analysis letter. This is something that is focused more on smaller developments that may not need to do a full transportation impact study because of the expectation that they would have a smaller impact or none on the system. So if they have fewer than 24 peak hour trips and fewer than 250 daily trips, and they're not expected to further impact either intersection operations or a safety concern, the city can allow them to just submit this letter instead. And it's a much lower effort for the developer. And just to give you a little example for that trip threshold, so 24 peak hour trips, that's about 24 single family homes, so or smaller. And that's also equal to about a 15,000 square foot office. So something rather small that would have fairly low trips. And again, we're not expecting any other impacts to performance or safety nearby. They would be allowed to just submit this short letter. And the letter includes the trip generation estimate for them, which basically allows us to know that they meet this criteria to only submit the letter. And then they just need to evaluate the access, looking at the spacing standards, making sure that the site distance, that there's a clear line of vision at the driveway and that that's appropriate for the site. And then just checking to make sure that the circulation around the development, they're providing proper connectivity to the adjacent land uses is appropriate, and that there's, again, no safety issue. They have to review some safety stuff, but it's a much lower threshold for them to fulfill. And then there's also zone changes sometimes. If people want to request a change in their zoning, or if they want to make a modification to the comp plan or transportation plan, which could be like a master plan. There's some traffic impact analyses that go with that as well. And this is typically following what I had mentioned, the transportation planning rule, which is the high level statewide rules. And it's more focused on long-term impacts. So looking 20 years out, you need to show what the performance would be under the current zoning, and then what the performance would be under your proposed zoning, and seeing if it changes anything in the TSP. So yeah, what is the growth increment compared to the planned use? So say you're going from, I don't know, R20, which would allow, a certain number of houses, and maybe you want to have higher density, you would be going to R10. So more houses would be able to be constructed with this zone change. So then you need to do the analysis based on that, and what type of impact or change would happen with allowing more houses within your development. And then you need to look at how the system would perform with that change to see if there would be any impacts. And then if there are, they need to make some recommendation on what those additional system improvements would be. And you compare that to the projects that are in your transportation system plan, because your transportation system plan was done based on the current zonings of your city. So if you are going to go in and make a change to zoning, you need to make sure that you're not affecting or creating a new need for a deficiency that was identified in the TSP already. So it's still a traffic impact study, but it's a little more nuanced, like I said, and it's really focused on a long range look, and it only addresses the zone change. If the zone change for, say, an example application is accepted or approved, they would then have to come in for another development application for the actual development. And then there would be another traffic impact study done just for that specific application. And that is it. Thank you.